What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hapness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Bob Dick, and we speak about self-organizing systems and what it means for communities and for businesses. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back and be inspired. Hello, Bob. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mirror.
I am excited. We're recording here in Melbourne in the State Library of Brisbane. I forgot the adapter to plug in my microphones.
So the sound will be a little less than perfect.
Yes. And it's not about the sound, it's about the content.
It's right.
And I'm more than excited for our conversation, as you have, built the Australian Facilitators Network. You are an expert in self-organizing systems. And I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I'm not sure that I ever really did. For me, facilitation is a valuable set of tools that, along with some other valuable sets of tools, allows me to do many things that I really enjoy doing.
Mm.
So I thought of myself probably as an educator, and maybe as an advisor or mentor, or a consultant.
So it would be an educator, a consultant, an advisor who facilitates?
Yes, he draws on facilitation skills
Yeah.
to help people make good decisions, to understand problems better, things like that.
And before you referred to facilitation as tools, and now as skills, and then there's something like a mindset of facilitation.
I think the mindset is extremely important, foundational to good work. And for most facilitators, the mindset is one of helping other people achieve what they want to achieve.
What do you mean by that?
The dictionary definition of facilitate is to make easy. So facilitate is only the business of making things easy for other people.
And still I wonder whether this is true. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if we make it too easy, it might either guide or push the group into a direction that's our direction, not the group's direction. And it might take away this learning process. And I'm thinking of parents who want to make it easy for their children to develop, and so they remove all the obstacles. Although in facilitation and group work, the obstacles and overcoming obstacles is actually the process to achieve goals and to grow.
It's more about making it easier in the sense of more possible for the clients to achieve their outcomes.
And we can do this by introducing a little bit of an obstacle in there.
Occasionally, yes, it can be very appropriate.
Yeah.
Or usually there are enough obstacles anyway within having to create them.
That's so true.
Not least of all the erroneous beliefs people, all us, already carrying in our heads most of the time.
Yes. And I have the impression that one big job of a facilitator that we rarely articulate is to make the implicit explicit. So
I think that's important. Facilitation has its ideological aspects too, and one of the reasons I'm reluctant to call myself a facilitator is just I do what I can to avoid the ideology.
what kind of ideology do you mean? And I think it would be very interesting to hear for the audience, because facilitation has been around, and I was personally in awe to see how facilitation is ingrained in Australia and for how long it has been around in Australia. Whereas in Germany, there's not even a word for facilitation. Right? So what makes you say that there's an ideology around facilitation, and what pushes you away from that?
I can give you an example. Most facilitators believe strongly that a facilitator, capital F, must stay out of the content and merely guide the process. My attitude is, why would I want to place that restriction on myself? I would mostly observe it anyway, because if people think I'm shaping the content in any way, they will doubt my neutrality. But there are, for instance, say I'm working with a senior management team that are about to make a decision that is going to have a big influence on their organisation, and I can see that they will later regret this. I don't want to contaminate my role as the manager looking after the process. So what I will do is I will make sure I'm holding a marker pen, and then I will make a point of putting it down on the table, and I will move to another part of the room, and I will say, I'm going to say something to you as Bob Dick citizen, so that you're free to ignore it. Now, from this perspective, it seems to me that you ignored this and this. And I think if you take them into account, you will later regret the decision that you're about to make. And then I will move back in front of the whiteboard, for instance, and pick up the marker and say, okay, over to you.
So then you're taking back the role of the facilitator.
Yes.
Whereas if you were hired as a consultant, you wouldn't have to make this switch because they wanted to hear your opinion.
Even as a consultant, I work on the assumption that if they make the decisions, they'll have commitment to them. If I make the decisions for them, they won't. So I'm being a kind of facilitator role anyway, most of the time, as a consultant. Now, from time to time, people will ask me to step out of that into an advisor role. And they'll say, I heard you talking a couple of weeks ago about the different motivations people have. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of how that's relevant to what we're doing? And I'll give a brief technical input and say, okay, one simple way of thinking about this is, for some people, the prime motivation is achieving power and control. And for others, it's getting good outcomes. And for others, it's building and maintaining relationships. And we all have all of those, but we tend to favour one or the other. Do you find that any up to you? And then I move back into the consulting problem, the facilitator role.
It's just beautiful if you can be in the stance. And if I understand you correctly, there's a belief that the ideology that the facilitator has to be neutral and cannot do that would avoid you from doing the job in the best way.
Constrain me unnecessarily. So, for instance, in all my educational work, I have a really strong commitment to my participation and ownership and engagement, but that's a fervent wish. It's not a rule of law. I can step outside that for sufficient reason. So if I'm consulting to a community, if it were possible to engage the whole community, I would prefer to do that. But there are time limits, and you can do wonders with the same people that you gather into the same room. But if the community won't fit in this single room, then it's going to take you a lot longer and a lot fussier processes. And so you cut corners. And because that's a choice to make it easier to achieve good outcomes, that's entirely okay.
Yeah. And this example makes me think that there is somehow a larger emotional burden on the labor of a facilitator than on many other professions. So we're speaking about ideology, we're speaking about do's and don'ts, and different perspective of what facilitation is. And funny enough, I have many guests on the podcast who say, I don't call myself a facilitator for various reasons, and many actually for similar reasons as you do. I don't want to wear the label because it puts me into a box that is too small for the work that I'm doing. Or if I introduce myself as a facilitator, I cannot charge the same rate as I would introduce myself as a consultant, although I do the same work.
I mean, you shouldn't negotiate the subcharge anyway. Because I don't know the other person's financial situation.
Yeah. That's a good one. So it's always the same way. Okay, charging is it. We could go on this tangent. Yes. This is an entire different conversation. And so important, I think most facilitators are undercharging.
I have tried never to have to do something because I needed the money. Doesn't always work out as a goal that works well for me.
Yeah. And maybe these two topics actually fit together. What I observe is many facilitators undercharge, and there's an emotional burden or an emotional something around the label of facilitator. And I think because we're very attached and there's a big commitment of being in service to the groups and doing good work, being in service to others, and hence charging for that seems maybe sometimes to many unethical, and maybe comes with a big responsibility that is overvalued. Where do you think does it come from? Why is it more difficult for facilitators to live into this role than for consultants or advisors or mentors?
I'm not sure as it is. I haven't really thought about it. I mean, one of the things that I think you asked when we talked earlier was, has facilitation changed over the roughly half century that I've been sort of doing it under some label or another? And I think there's a wish on the part of many people to professionalize it. I would prefer that didn't happen personally. And you can probably guess it, what some of the reasons are from we've already talked about. Because again, that's an unnecessary constraint that I was a registered psychologist for some years. And there are certain things, if you do as a psychologist, you're reaching the profession's code of ethics. And what if I don't agree with that code of ethics entirely? What if there are pieces of it I don't agree with? I still don't have a choice.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that's an unnecessary constraint on being fully open in the moment to whatever's happening.
Yeah. Intriguing. And what you're saying makes me think of quality control. And I think it could be a nice bridge to the other topic of self-organizing systems. So I try to weave it together. What I have in mind is that the moment we do not professionalize, everyone can call themselves a facilitator and guide groups in whatever shape or form they wish to do that. And I believe a facilitator can do harm, or a person, let's not call this person facilitator, can do harm to a group by not holding space, by opening a can of worms that they cannot control. I mean, there are many examples. And I think in many organizations, teams are traumatized by bad workshops. And they would reply with, oh, please, not another workshop. So I wonder, how do you find balance? How can you ensure quality? Or at least how can you help clients to find the right quality facilitator in a world where it isn't professionalized? And maybe in this way, build the bridge. How does it relate, or what have you learned from self-organizing systems about quality control and ensure that it goes in the intended direction without having an overarching jurisdiction or quality controller?
Well, there are so many dimensions to that question. Maybe one way in it is one of the written questions you asked, which was when the meeting is final. And I think it's often constructive to hold the view that meetings needn't fail. They're in the process of transforming from one thing to another. Mm-hmm. And some bits aren't going to go according to plan, and that's okay. Another of the dimensions is that relates to one of your other written questions, which, if I recall, was something like, to what extent can the process guide what's happening? Mm-hmm. And the answer is it can. And a novice facilitator is well advised to use robust processes that behave well, even in the hands of a relative novice. Mm-hmm. And I deliberately, and particularly in education work, use such processes so that what people see modelled, mm-hmm. they can then pick up and use, and it will work for them too. Then it's only when things get really tricky that I step out of that and try something else. And it relates to the public quality stuff in that I think W. Edwards Deming was one of the gurus of systems introduction generally. And if you look at most quality systems where people think they've implemented Deming, they still fall short of where he would have wanted them to go, because what he was advocating violated too many of their assumptions about how the world works. A step too far, which is the big obstacle to innovation. Another careful.
Being caught in assumptions.
Yeah. We're all caught in assumptions. It's unavoidable. And we are fortunate when a failure, inverted commas, draws our attention to them, if we're paying attention, if we can afford to pay attention.
And this way it gets wicked, right? So if I understand correctly, and this makes total sense, a novice facilitator focuses or relies on the process that facilitates the group.
Yes.
And a good example, I think, is design thinking. In order to guide a group through a design thinking process, you don't have to be a facilitator. You follow the steps, you do the exercise, and at the end you have some sort of a result.
That's right.
When a conflict emerges in this process, then you do need facilitation skills in order to transform and to use what is emerging in a creative way.
Or you can say, I'm lost, and walk out and let them sort it out for themselves and go back 10 minutes later to see where they've got.
Ooh, this points at another facilitation skill, which is courage.
I think many of the professions benefit from a fairly large steps of courage.
Yes. In this sense, then, if we come back to the quality, don't we need quality controls? I'm just asking provocatively.
Some things close enough to guaranteed that we can capture them in a rule or a procedure or even a quantitative measure, although that can be really tricky. And it makes sense to do that. And other things, you lose too many opportunities if you go that way. And so you leave that open. And because too many of the people in high places are there because their primary need is power and control over others, they tend to hang on to more control, and is actually better for the outcomes of leaving their team.
Mm.
And so most organisations are, I think in my experience, over-controlled because they underestimate what their people are capable of, given the encouragement and the autonomy.
Is it fear?
In some organisations it is. I mean, I was just reading yesterday, I forget where, about when Jack Welch was CEO of General Electric, and there would be annual appraisal for performance measurement, and the lowest 10%. And this would mean in their boss's opinion, theirs, were fired.
Wow.
How's that for running an organisation unfair?
Wow.
Now, GE was regarded as a successful organisation. Would you want to work for that kind of organisation?
And it just shows also how much our working culture has changed, our expectations towards our employers who would work for such an organization these days.
I think there have been big changes in, well, the most tangible changes, I guess, are probably in organisational structure. Because if you look at the early literature on bureaucracy, for example, bureaucracy wasn't a dirty word 50 years ago. It was the right way, the logical way, the best way to structure an organisation.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the descriptions, you anticipate anything that can go wrong and work out what would prevent it going wrong or fix it up when it did. And you would capture that in a rule or a procedure or a measure. And you would reward people for observing that and punish them when they didn't. And that used to work 50 years ago for many organisations. Now for most organisations it doesn't.
For many reasons, right? I mean, we have passed the industrial age and everything just changes more faster. So it isn't controllable anyway. So the idea of a self-organizing system almost sounds like the perfect solution. It almost would topic if it works well.
And yes, a better if is a really important thing. In our earlier discussion, kind of weeks ago now, I guess you asked how I got into this field, and I talked about being up to date with the literatures on industrial democracy and employee participation. And wanted to take that into a classroom when I, by accident, became an academic. And the results were very pedestrian because that wasn't where the class members expected to go.
Would you like to tell the story for the audience?
I think it's a good story. I think it makes 7 points. I remember my first class at Queensland University as a lecturer. It was in a chemistry lecture theatre. People who know University of Queensland would recognise this, a strongly sloped floor with fixed benches and long desks, and a dais at the front of the room and an enormous table on the front of the dais where chemistry lecturers presumably would perform chemistry experiments. And I'd been allocated this room for this class that I wanted to treat as a self-organising system. So I sat on the front of this enormous desk because I'd read some way that good educators did that rather than sit behind it.
I think they still do.
And I said, I don't know what's going to be in this course, so let's plan it together. And that was so alien to the expectations of the people on their own. And they kind of did their best, but the results were very ordinary. What I finished up doing instead was I facilitated the early weeks to get people ready for a transition point where they knew it would be as much of it as they were willing to take on would be handed over to them.
So you basically trained them, or you helped them to develop the skills that they would need to then self-design the lecture.
That's right. And more than the skill was the mindset, the attitude, the expectation.
Can you give a few examples? What are the skills and what is the skill set and what is the mindset needed for that?
The best example is at Queensland Uni, I had a fourth-year class. In its later years, it was called Advanced Social Consultancy because it was fairly broad. And it was expected to cover the basics of organisational psychology and collective decision-making and things like that. So there was a boundary that we were expected to stay within, and we did. In the first 4 weeks, I would do a lot of intense relationship building for the class as a whole. Numbers were typically between 12 and 24, so small enough you can fairly easily build a real sense of community. And that people would form very small, self-chosen groups, and we'd do relationship building within those groups that were as intensive as they were going to do.
How large were the small groups?
Typically 3 or 4. Pairs don't work as well for some reason or other, and something happens with about 5 group members where the dynamics change and officers have a hard time. I mean, one of the marks of an experienced facilitator is that they work more comfortably with much larger groups. I think the largest number of people I've had in one room at one time was probably 200, and I reckon I could push that to 300 if I had to for any reason. Although I reckon there'd be another transition at around about 300, and I'd want to split it up into pieces or do something like that. And so relationship building was the important part, and sometimes explicitly, but almost everything else we did, I looked for opportunities to encourage self-disclosure between people, because that's what builds empathy and a wish to collaborate.
To find commonalities.
That's it.
And the shared humanity.
That's right. Having some of the good relationship exercises work partly because even when people are telling very different stories to each other, there are themes to those stories which overlap from person to person. And so I get to see that, yes, you're a real person too. And one of the early North American conflict management gurus, Sheldon Davis, I think his name was, I remember seeing him on film being interviewed by civil government, and they watched a simulation of Sheldon at work with a threesome who were in trouble, and then he saw something like, he didn't do a lot, but whenever he intervened, a lot happened. How did you decide when and how to intervene? And Sheldon Davis said, I work on the basic assumption then when people recognise each other as real people, and I don't remember his exact words, but it was to the effect of, we are hardwired to identify with one another. We think we're part of the same tribe.
Yeah.
And so it's about providing opportunities to discover the commonalities without losing the differences, because they're valuable too.
So the moment that there is a connection and trust, then he wouldn't have to intervene that much. That's what you're saying?
That's right.
Yeah.
We did a lot more in the first 4 weeks, and an important part of it, and this wasn't my design, this came out of a suggestion by one of the classes, I would provide an informal party at my home on the Saturday or Sunday between the first and second week of the first semester, to which the previous year's class were also invited.
Beautiful.
And I would introduce them to one another, and then unless they asked me to stay, I would leave so that they could talk openly, so that this year's class could hear from us, last year's class. How can we get the most out of this? Because that was what they wanted to talk about.
So this system learns intrinsically.
Yeah. And then somewhere around about week 3, we would spend a week away together. Not a week, 2 days, a weekend, off on the campus, because a small group of them would organise that I'd ask for volunteers. And so that begins to draw people into their own agency and their own willingness to exercise autonomy for the good of the class. And it was half work and half play, because it was only play, nobody would have come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas if it was half work, they'd come. But the play was so that they saw each other and other students.
Mm. And how do you define play?
This will sound like a detour. Language is a very poor tool for communicating, because it works by chopping the world up into pieces and labeling each one. And the world isn't chopped up into pieces.
And we each have different understandings of the words.
That's right. So we have to negotiate. We have to negotiate a common language before we can really communicate.
Yeah. And even then it's difficult.
That's right.
Okay, so half work, half play, in order to create community further, or to already plant seeds of content, or to create the autonomy, to push them over the threshold of autonomy?
Because it was a weekend, there would always be a handful of people who just couldn't be there. And so there couldn't be any essential content.
Mm-hmm.
But if I could open doors to foundational ideas, then it didn't matter if not everybody got those, because not everybody in the class gets everything anyway.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most classes get a lot less than the person running the class imagines, I reckon.
Isn't the same for meetings?
That's right. And so it's okay, let a handful who get the message, spread it in their small groups to their colleagues, and apply it in the way they make decisions there.
Interesting. And would you make this explicit, that this is their duty and responsibility, or is it something that grows organically because they're excited about the content they learned and hence want to share it?
I'm not claiming this is any good. I'm talking about how I am, and therefore how I can operate. I have a strong distaste for being controlled by others, and a strong distaste for controlling others. And so I try to keep it fun for me too, as well as everybody else, by avoiding being controlled or controlling. And when it's necessary, I look for ways of making it safe and as enjoyable as possible.
Mm.
And so it's really a matter of, I can probably afford to encourage higher levels of class agency to keep it fun for me than some of my colleagues would choose. And they will get good outcomes too in their different way.
Yeah. And what happened then?
Well, we did a lot of other things too. And for instance, usually somewhere around about week 3, I would invite in 4 or 5 of my consultant colleagues, and I would choose them to be very diverse. I would split the class up into 5 small groups, and they would rotate around the 5 facilitators so that they could talk in a very small group with them. And the consultants would talk about how they did advanced social consultancy, which was the class topic.
Mm-hmm.
And the small group they were working with would ask them questions.
Mm.
What do you do? How does that work?
So basically, what this is facilitating is them understanding the applied nature of the topic instead of the theoretical concept.
That's right.
So after they had these small conversations with those who actually do the job, they know what they want and need to learn in order to do this job.
That's right.
Beautiful.
And this was, 74 when we started Queensland Theory. my classes were probably working adequately by about 78, 79. Took me that much trial and error to get near enough to where I wanted to go. And I became trial and error after that anyway, because every class is different. And so when I set recipes about what I did, these are just examples of some of the early tasks to get people working as a community and enjoying having as much agency as they were willing to within the university-defined boundaries.
And what I hear is a very clear process of connection over content, of building, enabling agency and curiosity. And would you use a similar process for organizations then, or community? The AFN could be one example. So.
Mostly, they don't allow me enough time for that.
The organizations. Invite them to your home.
But for instance, I've been reading Roger Schwartz's book, Smart Leaders, Smarter Teams, which is really an application of Chris Argyris's work. And Roger has, I think it's 9 process guidelines, and he has this enormous front end before the real work starts of groups that he's working with learn these 9 guidelines, and only when they are observing them do they move on to the real issues. And clearly, that will work pretty well if he's given enough front-end time to be able to do it.
Yeah.
I haven't ever, or very rarely, been given that. I mean, the closest was some community development work probably 3 decades ago now, which was, it was called a community revitalisation project, and a colleague from the Queensland Small Business Corporation and I did it in a whole lot of provincial centres in southeastern Queensland. We probably did, 14 or 15 over the course of several years. And Dal, who was the project officer from QSBC, or Eve later on, would come and live in the community for 6 weeks. And beginning with the people that had asked to be involved in the program, typically the local Chamber of Commerce and the local Shire Council or Town Council or City Council in a couple of cases. And then they would build relationships with those key players, and then they would build relationships with their networks, and then they would build relationships with their networks. And then targeting their networks. And Bill and Eve was superb to me. Like I had joined somewhere in about week 6 to run a one-day strategic visioning activity. And Del and Eve were already being treated as a local. In some communities where you almost had to be second generation in the community for that to happen for most people. So there was something about their ability to really connect with people and build relationships that everyone interacted with. And that is set up by a steering committee, or we'll call it a steering committee these days. It's inviting them to steer. And that's not how I like to do things. And then I just facilitated a one-day activity for somewhere between 50 and 100 people, typically, drawn to represent the whole community. But then we would set up small working parties of just 4 or 5 direct stakeholders, and each small working party would have a topic chosen by the community as a whole, or the 50 to 100 on behalf of the whole community. But each working party was really committed to their particular topic because they were people that had a direct stake in that topic. And it was good for them if it succeeded. And so you didn't need to give them instructions. They would do whatever it took to get it to work. And all the topics were chosen so that they hung together to turn this community long-term into the kind of community people had said they were living.
Yeah. And because they built all these relationships in the first place, they were genuinely interested in representing them and connecting to get the information to be able to represent them.
And because they'd recommended me to the community, I could walk in week 6 and run a successful one-day exercise.
And it sounds as if there's a maximum number of people, of a community, members, for such a system to work.
I could write a sweet book on that. Depending on how diverse the community is, you might need a group as large as 100 or more to cover all the basic interests in it. But then I don't want them to act as if they're representatives for their interest group. Because that ties their hands and they can't enter into genuine discussions with somebody from another interest group.
Yeah.
They have to keep in mind, I have to consult back to my group. So I ask each of them, even though they're chosen, to know what happens for a particular interest group and know that interest group really well, to try to act for the good of the community as a whole. And not to feel they have to consult anybody else. They're free agents to engage with each other in this. And so just in that little thing,
yeah, it's so founded in trust, and it makes a lot of sense because the moment where they are representatives, it's not self-organizing anymore, because then you're back into this bureaucratic, in air quotes, system where you follow processes and have to involve, and the way you explain it, for me, it sounds more organic, where of course you represent the groups because you're part of the group.
That's right.
And that's your duty. So it's intrinsically motivated instead of extrinsically motivated by rules and guidelines.
That's the processes. And then there's typically a coordinating group, and they're forbidden to exercise any control over anything. Their only task is to understand what each of the groups, each of the working parties is doing, and to let other working parties know when that might impact on them, and to be a conduit between the working parties and the community and vice versa. So everyone stays informed about how their piece of the action relates to the larger picture. So it's a communication hierarchy that isn't a control hierarchy.
Yes. Reminds me of holacracy.
Oh, that's a whole other topic. Wow. I'm more familiar with the earlier version of sociocracy. And in fact, holacracy is much more constrained than sociocracy is. There's just a few core principles that don't necessarily tie people's hands.
Yeah.
In the sociocratic version.
Yeah, I think the holacracy is what I heard. One of the biggest criticisms is that it treats humans almost like machines, so it's very process driven.
Yes. And that's good for some people because it doesn't violate so many of their assumptions about how systems are supposed to work.
Yeah. And it's very clear on roles and responsibilities and who does what. And everyone is very autonomous on their area. And I think this keeps things relatively easy and avoids lots of conflict. The question is, do we always want to avoid conflict? Because I think that we're missing lots of beautiful opportunities for creativity, emergence, and growth through conflict.
I agree with that. The way forward is to encourage people to express differences openly as far as they can without owning them.
Can you give an example?
To make it a community responsibility, not an individual responsibility. So an example would be, let's say I'm facilitating a group and somebody makes a very dogmatic statement. Then I might call a halt and say, we're going to invite you to find a different way of saying what you just said so that it will be easier for you to change your mind if somebody else has a different view to offer. Do you think you could do that? Make it a challenge?
Because we fall in love with our own ideas. And words create worlds.
And if the person is having difficulty, I say, let me tell you how I might try to say what you just said. These words won't work for you. You would need to find your own, but I might say this and this and this. Does that help you decide how you might frame that in a way that is taking this ownership of the idea? So in effect, coach the person in the direction of changing the way they've expressed their idea.
Yeah. I think this conversation of this topic is so relevant on not only the organizational level and how to help organizations to be less controlling and more self-organized, but also to all these communities that are suddenly emerging. I have the impression that we're living in the decade or maybe the century of communities. They are just mushrooming everywhere. And I've seen only a few functioning ones where members are intrinsically motivated to contribute, where they're taking ownership of their ideas but sharing them. What can we learn from your experience about how communities work or fail?
I think the Australasian Facilitators Network is a good example here. Mm-hmm. It's in its 26th year. There are no office bearers. There's a handful of people that are treated as elders, but they don't have any authority.
Mm-hmm. So he does with them.
As wise.
Mm-hmm. Treated as wise. I love the framing.
There's no constitution. We have a member who volunteered to keep a trust account on their behalf, so we have a bank account. Every year, so far, without fail, a group of people somewhere in Australia or New Zealand or both has said, we will design and present a gathering, a conference next year. And that's happened every year so far. So I think this year will be year 26. 800 fully autonomous people in a fully autonomous organisation where things happen, where somebody has the enthusiasm to start them, and the community orientation to take it back to the AFN as a whole and ask, I would like to do this. Who would be interested in joining me and helping this to happen if anyone has any reservations?
So nobody is asking the elders for permission, but directly the group, if anyone is interested. And then if nobody is interested, it's basically not having permission. Oh, well, they can do it on their own.
That's right.
And yesterday I heard, I think from Catherine, that the AFN, the Australasian Facilitators Network, functions on a mailing. So it's your community platform with very big air quotes is a mailing list.
That's right, a plain text mailing list.
So all this organization, all these groups who would get together and say, okay, we are hosting this year's annual conference, they're doing this via email.
Yeah, solely email. But I think
what they will then need, obviously.
The email list is possibly the most important vehicle. There are people who aren't subscribed to the list, but are subscribed to local lists. So there are local lists in 5 or 6 centres around Australia, including Sydney and Melbourne and Perth. There's an attempt to get a group going in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales at the moment, and this is the third time somebody's attempted does it. the previous two fizzled, so let's see how we go. But Sydney's been going for 30 years, I think, wasn't it? In their 30th year as a Self-Organising Network.
And when you started it, I would be curious in two things mainly, and let's see where it goes from there. What was the purpose? What was the intention? And if you don't have a constitution, what else? What is the glue that sticks, keeps the group together?
Let me tell the origin story, and that allows me to make clear that I was just one of a number of actors who helped it get off the ground. I think it was Kevin Bonham, who was, I think at the time, was Australian-based, and expert in the TOPS methodology, facilitation methodology, theory of participation, it's short for something like that. Gary, I think in an earlier contact we talked about your surprise at the maturity of the Facilitation Network in Victoria. And the Land King in Victoria had to skill people up if they were to engage local farming communities. And Kevin was involved in some of that early training. And so there was a conference in Melbourne, 98 it may be. I heard about it from different quarters. There was another one of the occasional relatives. She just said an out of the area thing. And they'd have run me and said, there's a conference in Melbourne, wherever it was, somewhere in Victoria. I think you should come along. And there'll be a table for you to display your books if you're interested. So that decent kind of deal. People had such a good time together because a lot of people working as facilitators felt isolated. And now all of a sudden, he was their tribe. You can imagine the sense of community that grows out on that. And so later in the conference, there was a session where there was a discussion about, let's continue this. And somebody said, let's set up a working party to draft a constitution. And at that stage, I said, I forget what I said exactly, but it was along the lines of, look, we don't have to be urgent about this. I'm sure that some across here who I had a half-time appointment will let me set up a mailing list, and we can stay in contact on my mailing list, and that gives us time to make whatever decisions we want to make. And people had said, that worked pretty well. How long do you think the AFN will last? I would have said I'd give it 5 years.
Wow.
Because I thought there was almost always hardening of the entries. Because we've spent somewhere around about 6,000, 7,000 years being trained that control hierarchies are the way to structure systems. And we've forgotten our 200,000 year history before that. Most of the time we lived in collaborative small tribes and clans where people were committed to the common good, and where individual survival depended on whole tribe survival. And so the tribe evolved, social systems evolved, concepts evolved, and that's faster than individual evolution. So that's all in our heads still. But I was allayed by the 6,000 years since civilization, particularly the 200 odd since the Industrial Revolution, because that really amplified what happened up to that point and fixed it in concrete.
Yeah.
And that's still with us. We have to overcome that somehow or other.
So what can we learn from the success story of the AFN? Because what is happening now in this network, if I understand correctly, is that there are regular sessions, workshops, members contribute, or offer something to the entire community or look for collaborators. And there's a yearly conference. So is it a community of practice?
The AFN functions as a large community of practice, and there are smaller communities of practice within that in some of the centres. Sydney has regular activities, Melbourne has regular activities, Perth have regular activities, some of the other regional centres meet to this attempt to get South East Queensland, Northern New South Wales up and running. The notion is we'll meet every couple of months, virtually initially. I mean, one of the blessings to come out of COVID is that we have learnt the power of Zoom. How we don't have to generate carbon with thousands of air miles. We can do it on the ether instantly. And that's been good. Although it's not the same as face-to-face, I have to say.
Yeah, different. But I have the impression that especially for larger communities, the beauty of Zoom and the randomness of the breakout rooms gives us more opportunities to really speak to everyone that naturally in the same space we wouldn't have.
I think that's right. And the last couple of years, our gatherings have been virtual. There's been talk that if there's a gathering this year, it might be hybrid. Some people meeting face-to-face and others able to Zoom in, at least for some sessions. It would be good if it goes that way. I think that seems like a good option to try and see how we can get it to work well for us. There's something else going on at the moment too, which may have implications, and that is that the International Association of Facilitators used to treat the AFN as its Australasian chapter. And then they wanted to formalise their relationship with chapters. And how do you formalise a relationship with an 800-strong self-organising network? And they gave up on that and set up an oceanic chapter, they call it. Harry did that without considering the feelings of some of the AFN people who got their noses out of joint, got a bit excited by it. There have been attempts at rapprochement between the two just in the last few years, and that looks as if it might really come to fruition this year, because the current director of the IAF has really made a special effort to treat AFNers as members of the IAF for conference, for paying conference fees, and the AFNers being for if any of them wanted to contribute to the IAF conference in some way, they're welcome to do that. So there's been a big reach out from the IAF in our direction, so that might be the larger facilitation network. Yeah. Lots of people are members of both.
And it sounds like a good common ground to collaborate in that sense without merging.
Yeah. What would the facilitator groups not be talking about? It's crazy.
Yeah. And I wonder whether this brings us back to our earlier topic of the ideology of what facilitation is, what a community of practice and facilitators is. Because the IAF, they have their own certification program. They have their own very clear rules or guidelines of what facilitation is, which clearly contradicts with your opinion from what I understood earlier.
And I think that's good, because it means that people do feel more comfortable in a more structured organisation, join the IAF.
Yeah.
And those that are more comfortable in the self-organising network join the AFN, and those of it that don't get all that excited about these issues join both.
Yeah.
And there's enough overlap in membership that there has always been some level of cooperation, tacit or explicit.
Yeah. And I'd like to come back to the Constitution. Constitution sounds like a very heavy thing to have. And I wonder whether you do have something equivalent like guiding principles or core beliefs or values formalized. Is there anything formalized?
Rather than answer to your multidimensional question, there have been practices that have developed which are likely to continue if they work and nobody substitutes a better alternative. For instance, the people who organised the previous year's gathering was always offer support to people organising the current year's gathering.
Reminds me of your students.
There was a practice where there was a ceramic bottle-shaped flask which people imbued with, how can I say this, mystic properties, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And 5 or 6 years ago, one of the participants at a gathering brought a young child along who knocked it over and it broke. Oops. And what happened? Consternation, and then can't do anything better now. Let's proceed without it. And there are other similar mystic objects. To oversimplify, there's a sort of ideological dimension which you could label sceptic at one end and mystic at the other. And we've got both in the AFN, although I think the mystics are the large majority. I'm one of the skeptics.
I'm not surprised.
And that's a benefit if we don't get too excited about the negatives. And I've co-facilitated with enough mystics who are better facilitators than I am, because they're better at acting in the moment.
Mm.
I'm always a fraction of a second behind the action, because I like to understand what I'm doing as I do it. For them, that's a luxury they can't afford.
Do you mean?
They act in the moment.
So it's more the
They're being conscious of what they're doing.
Where the facilitator becomes the medium.
That's right.
A bit of
And when we co-facilitate with people like this, they do stuff that I couldn't get to.
Is it talent? Is it skill set? Or is it mindset?
Simply about how they're wired, I think. I think if autism had been a common diagnosis when I was young, or all being diagnosed is on the spectrum, there's no point fussing about it. That's the way it is.
So it's difficult to read the room and to get the subtleties that the others would get.
So that has to be a requirement skill.
Mm-hmm.
I have to make a practice of defocus and be aware of the overall movement and how many people that come frozen and how many are enlivened, and then scan the faces. I can't just take it in when they're there. I need to make it a procedure.
When did you become aware and how did you learn? I find this fascinating because many facilitators believe that it's all about reading the room and understanding the body language of people and the unsaid and the subtleties.
And it is. But there are two ways of doing it. Again, to oversimplify.
Mm-hmm.
I found myself in with roles where facilitation was a useful set of skills. Someone said that's required.
And I'm making this up. What I can see as beneficial, and we talked about that earlier, that with this way of your brain functioning, it's even more important to make the implicit explicit, because the implicit might escape. So speaking out everything that is there.
I like to do that anyway.
Mm.
Because the educator role is fairly firmly lodged in me.
Mm-hmm.
That's been an important part in psychology at Queensland Uni. I think I had the highest teaching load in the psychology department. something like 25 hours a week, which is enormous for a university academic.
Yeah, in Germany they complain about 8.
Yeah. And I was happy with that. They were applied courses, and I wanted people to have good, robust processes that as novices they could use well. But I wanted them to understand why the processes were, so that when they did it, they had some escape clause, an escape hatch. So I developed the habit early on of trying to be explicit while modelling the processes we were talking about and explaining what I was doing while I did it, to provide the backstory to have the process function, and that's become part of how I like to operate.
And I wonder whether this wouldn't be actually the perfect way to teach facilitation.
I think it's easier for a skeptic to teach facilitation. A beautiful example from football. I was talking about this with some family members, their offspring, a couple of weeks ago, and one of them made the example between Ollie Lewis, who was a superb footballer, but a bit better than mediocre coach, in this person's opinion, and somebody who was a superb coach had been a competent but not brilliant player. And the way in which Michael, I think, is that person describing it, the way Michael described it, well, he just knew what to do and did it. And that worked as a team player or as a captain. But coaching others, he didn't have the intellectual understanding of how he did it to be able to act as a coach. Whereas the other person whose name I can't retrieve at the moment, I don't think I'm going to try, operated more in the way that I do, and so understood how Wally Lewis could be such a superb footballer. And could help other people with that talent to become superb.
So if I understand correctly, someone who is maybe less talented as a facilitator could be the better trainer of facilitation.
Reluctant to be cut and dried about it, but I suspect that might be right.
Because they're relying less on their intuition and have to actually think it through or rationalize, understand what they are doing or might be doing.
They're more likely to be good about connecting the abstract to the specific, the principle to the example, things like that.
Yeah. What remains your number one facilitation challenge?
I'm not really sure. It kind of varies from time to time. I've given up trying to work in the moment. So I can't do it that way, so let me find other ways in which I can do it in best of my ability. It's not just as a facilitator, it's as a citizen too, but I think it applies particularly to those roles that overlap with facilitator. I think the world is in a liminal period at the moment in between paradigms. I think given the kind of future we probably face, we need to become more comfortable with self-organising systems and giving genuine autonomy at the community face and the work face to the people who have to be responsive to what's happening in the moment. And so many of our principles and beliefs into that happening. And if I preach that message, it backs people into a corner and they become dogmatic and polarized. So how can I open the door to an idea, to a different angle on the mindset that invites those who are willing to take a peek? Because if there's no pressure, there's no pushback. That's hard. Still working on the form of words that allows me to do that.
And you can imagine that it's especially hard in a world where so many things are catching our attention. And the louder, the brighter, the maybe more polarized will attract more attention. And then it's a different ballgame.
Look at the number of criticisms of Albanese as not having a spine. I have a very different take on Albanese. I think he has as much courage as anybody in politics. He was willing to put his effort into grooming other people for leadership of the Labour Party, and only when it looked as if he was the best person for it did he step into that role, and then challenged as much as he could till he could end. That's a courageous thing to do from my perspective. But people look to what they call strong leadership, and that locks them into the old paradigm, I think.
Because it's healthy.
But because it's well practiced, it's leaded, with experience. Our education system, from the earliest years, this is changing. But the teacher is up front and knows things that we have to learn.
It's funny that our educational system is still organized as if we're in industrial age, where nowadays all the information is at our fingertips. And I find it interesting that the concept about questions has changed. And it seems that the paradigm shift hasn't changed around it. And what I mean by that is, back in the days, we had to ask questions in order to get information. Nowadays, we ask Google or ChatGPT questions, but we don't ask each other questions necessarily to get information, but we rather ask questions to hear another perspective or to get the human side of things. And still there is this big thing about asking questions, that it's perceived as vulnerable because we don't know, and therefore we have to ask questions.
I agree with that, and I think that's sort of the whole paradigm. Part of the difficulty, I think, is that from an old paradigm perspective, the bureaucratic way of doing things seems opposed to the collaborative tribal way of doing things. They're a best of both worlds combinations. If we can learn to fit those two mindsets together, they can actually strengthen each other. But it's tricky to do that. That would be another facilitation challenge, if you like.
Because it would, if I understand correctly, basically provides some sort of loose structures or guidelines or systems or environments, context in which the self-organization can take place, but they don't need to reinvent the wheel each time.
And I think self-organising happens more easily with any defined boundary. I think of it as freedom within limits. And if the limits are clear, and they can't be set in concrete because that tends to be counterproductive. So clear but negotiating.
I wrote my master's thesis back in the days on informal contract enforcement. So how can we enforce contracts that are not written and where we don't have a legal system to enforce them? And what you're saying reminds me of that. So how can we make sure that there's some enforcement that is not set in stone, but that comes from the system itself? So how do you get to this kind of self-regulation where everyone watches each other or makes sure that the organization remains within these boundaries?
I'm not sure. Tribal cultures, and there are scattered examples of this in some of the other social primates too, in the literature. Tribal cultures sanction people who use their talents for personal benefit rather than common good. Actually, the sanctions don't change their behaviour. They face exile or execution. But we don't have the sense of community that gives us, in effect, the authority to do that. It's a real issue.
Yeah, and I think that, Twitter is an example. And I think we've all observed the shitstorms on Twitter because nobody is there to sanction or to collectively decide, okay, there's specific behaviors that we won't support by not commenting. Because the biggest punishment on Twitter is just to ignore, right? Because then they will die out. And somehow the community doesn't get to the point that this is actually the perfect equilibrium.
Because it isn't a community.
Because it isn't a community. And still in smaller communities, I wonder, what would be your advice or idea on how to enable the self-regulatory system that the community will preserve some guiding principles of how they relate to each other, work with each other?
The organizations that have, I think, had the most success at that set up small groups that are self-organising systems. A beautiful Dutch example is Beurzel.
Yes. The nurses.
900 nursing teams, 10 to 12 people per team, each responsible for a defined geographical area. So there's no necessary team interdependency, just team on team. And so they can be fully autonomous. Have their own venue, find their own clients, maintaining their own profit and loss statement. There's a website that allows them to stay in touch with other teams so they learn from each other. But the inter-team dependencies aren't essential, aren't part of the job here and now. And there are other examples too, like the Chinese white goods manufacturer.
And is it then about the smaller groups within the larger groups so that they remain agile, basically?
That's right. And with a larger structure that allows them to do that.
Yeah.
But it's still no middle managers. There's just about the owner and somewhere around about 10,000 nurses.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think there's a LinkedIn group founded by Anamalia Dorgo, and it's also self-organizing. And it's beautiful to see how they are building small teams. So someone putting their hand up, wanting to share something, wanting to start something, a movement, and then it just organically grows. I think over the pandemic, over the last 3 years, they grew from 5 to 3,000. Yeah.
Well, Beurzel started as a single team and grew from there, and now they're going international.
And maybe to close, we're speaking for 1.5 hours already. Last question, because in our exploration call, we laughed about the concept of the saying that facilitating facilitators is like herding cats. And then you replied, it's like, no, it's like herding squirrels.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. How does a self-organizing organization work with facilitators, where everyone knows how to do things, that everyone has a better idea of? I have the impression that facilitators, very often, me included, as soon as I put my facilitation hat off and then become a participant, I'm an absolute nightmare to facilitators.
Well, I suspect that almost every facilitator has his own preferred way of doing things. And so if you're a participant, the person up the front isn't doing it the way you would have. And the adversarial systems we live in, I mean, the Anglophone world is particularly bad here. The legal system is adversarial, whereas that's less true on the continent. And the educational system tends to be adversarial. It's about rewarding the best and assuming that it's the fault of the worst, that they're the worst. That's an adversarial mindset. Somehow or other, if when we're acting as facilitators, we don't then take our authoritarian mindset with us when we become participants. The way I deal with that is I find that if I arouse my curiosity about what is this person going to do and how will I get to live. So if I stir my curiosity, I'm in a different frame of mind, and I'm accepting that they know what they're doing, and I'm open to learning from them.
Under the assumption, coming back to your earlier answer, that a workshop can never fail. So it just goes into different directions.
That's right.
Yes.
Because when I'm curious, I'm not defensive. The ego defense disappears.
Yes.
I'm a good thesis supervisor in the early stages of thesis because I help people be clear about what excites them and how they can turn that into good research. But then in the later stages, I need to become contrarian and look at it from an examiner's point of view and be nitpicky. And I find it really hard to do that. Because I've bashed that part of me into submission.
I've practiced. We're curious, we are not defensive.
I read a book recently that the term the person used was wonder. And that's a beautiful term for it. When we arouse a sense of wonder, what's happening here? Magic can happen.
Yes. And to hold our own expectations and desired outcomes a bit more loosely, to allow space for wonder and curiosity.
Sociocracy and holacracy both do that really well with the notion of consent decision making. Somebody offers a decision. I don't say, is that what I would have done? I say, can I live with that? If so, I say, I consent.
Good reminder. And also brings back to mind that practicing improv theater, such a good skill to learn for a facilitator. Or maybe any member of a self-organizing system. Because basically you have to work with all of us.
I'm very clumsy doing improv because I find hard to act in the moment.
She's up there.
Not my thing. But yes, I agree with you. Some of the people I know who are superb facilitators are really good at improv.
And then, yes, you can still hold the concept and the guidelines, the values of improv.
Of saying yes.
Yes. Yeah. The yes-anding, the making your partner look good, accepting all offers. You can hold them closely and still not being a very good improv player.
Yep.
My phone shows me that we are speaking for almost 100 minutes. Is there anything that you would have liked to share? I'll say that we haven't touched upon yet.
We have touched on so much. And so much of it is such rich stuff, I think, that these are the sorts of conversations that help us collectively work out how we're going to move from this liminal period into whatever the next paradigm can best be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And use our facilitation skills to make it possible. Easy, yeah. Thank you, Pop. Thank you for staying tuned and for listening to the show. I know how busy you are, and I appreciate that you're sharing your two most valuable resources with me and my guest, your time and your attention. If you're looking for more conversation with other facilitators and for a community of practice, why don't you join Never Done Before, the community that I have built, and many of my podcast guests are already members. Visit neverdonebefore.org, and I wish to see you there.